I would love to see basically 3 focus areas for the 21st century skills, right? The one which is the foundational core skills, which presumably most schools and education deal with, the literacy, numeracy, scientific, and all that. The second area, competencies, in terms of, how can students, how can young citizens approach complex challenges? And that's everything to do with problem solving, critical thinking, creativity, collaboration. And then the third piece is the character qualities, right, which allow you to approach changing environments, the things we talked about: initiative, curiosity, persistence, grit.
Hello, and welcome back to the 21st Century Visionary Podcast. I'm your host, Sanat Singhal, a young 17-year-old kid with the vision to connect young people with the content and community to dream an inspiring vision for society and make it a reality. That's why every episode I feature the stories of young people who have and are continuing to execute on their visions, or the veterans who have made their visions a reality and in doing so, redefined life in the 21st century. In this special episode, we are releasing the recording of the first ever live 21st Century Visionary Talk in partnership with Tile.org and the Nebula Challenge, featuring the amazing and insightful Roger Spitz. Tile.org is the world's largest conversation series, so check it out if you want to start your own local chapter and host conversations with entrepreneurs and business leaders in your area. And the Nebula Challenge is an international entrepreneurship competition for high schoolers. I will link to both of these in the description and in the show notes. It was such a treat to facilitate this conversation between Roger and our next generation. Roger is such a great speaker and really breaks down complex topics into understandable and actionable frameworks we can use to future-proof our careers and businesses. Based in San Francisco, Roger is the founder of TechEssential, the global foresight, strategy, and futures intelligence platform. Roger is also founding chairman of the Disruptive Futures Institute. He has 2 decades of experience leading investment banking businesses, advising CEOs, founders, boards, and shareholders of companies globally on how to future-proof their business. As the former head of technology, mergers, and acquisitions with BNP Paribas, Roger advised over 50 transactions across the world with an overall deal value of $25 billion. Roger is also an advisor to a number of accelerators, incubators, and venture capital funds in Silicon Valley, including Berkeley Skydeck and the NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center. In this conversation, we cover Roger's unique career trajectory, how he got into foresight and futures thinking, his current work with TechEssential and the Disruptive Futures Institute, the role of AI in the future, the AAA framework he has developed for businesses and individuals to future-proof themselves and their organizations, reforming the education system, the rise of generalists, Roger's investing criteria, must-read books, and much, much more. So get ready to change the way you think about the future after listening to this conversation with Roger Spitz. So Roger, just to kick it off, could you give just a brief intro about your personal story, career trajectory, and how you actually got into foresight and futures thinking?
No, for sure, Sanat. I just wanted to thank you, Sanat, and the organizations for having me, and for, most importantly, treating this as an important topic. For me, it is an important topic, probably more important than most of the keynote talks I'm paid to give day to day within, with larger companies and that. So I think that's just the starting point, which is you cannot be in a position of not looking at the future. And that's an important message for all of us as we take ownership of our lives, but also an important message for policymakers and educators. On a personal level, so I'm born in South Africa, and I lived in quite a few different countries. In the US, I lived in Europe, I've lived in London, if that's considered Europe, I'm not sure anymore. And I've moved around quite a bit. The majority of my life I spent in the UK and with an eye to the rest of the world. And I started my career at something which is not as common in Silicon Valley, but more kind of the usual New York, London kind of route, which is in investment banking. So for 20 years or so, I advised basically entrepreneurs, CEOs, shareholders on future-proofing their companies and their ventures through mergers and acquisitions and investments, strategic partnerships. And what brought me to what I'm doing today was really that I started to notice that given exponential technologies, given the speed and scale of change and disruption, that the traditional strategic playbook, which a lot of companies, followed, basically was of limited values in themselves, future-proofing themselves. In other words, you saw entire industries which were fundamentally changing or reshaping overnight, startups and new businesses, new models, platforms, networks, which were seemingly coming out of nowhere and displacing even some of the largest incumbents. And so I spent a lot of time over the past few years trying to understand better disruption and innovation, including spending time, obviously, in Silicon Valley. I'm based in San Francisco, as you mentioned, but also in Israel, and immersing myself with some of the key organizations which are really very good at understanding these aspects. So one of which is Santa Fe Institute, which is one of the world leaders in complexity science and systems thinking. Spent a bit of time at the D School around the corner from you, Sanat, at Stanford for design thinking and innovation. Singularity University on exponential technologies, a bit of time with MIT on AI and strategy. And really what I found that connected the dots the best between all of these themes around change and disruption was actually futures and foresight. And so that's when I decided to study it in more depth, but also to professionalize that journey, because I felt that it connected the best complexity, disruption, innovation, exponential technologies, transformation, strategy, and of course, futures under one kind of umbrella, let's say. And that's really what I did. And so more recently, I founded, as you said, Tech Essential, which is a play on the words technology and existential. And that is an advisory. So I advise, companies on foresight. I'll talk about that a bit later, on futures. And Disruptive Futures Institute, which is something that I'm very dear to, and which is the context why we're speaking, which is the education side, which is helping the world understand the changes that are happening, and more importantly, what you can do about it and how best to prepare and navigate and thrive and enjoy this disruption.
Yeah, that's quite a fascinating bio, and I think quite unconventional in the space that you're now dealing with foresight and futures thinking. So it kind of shows that you went along this different path and then really saw a need in the space and a need for thinking more about these disruptive technologies, thinking more about the future, and then went into this separate path to actually fill that need. So I'd love to hear about how you actually went about making that transition from investment backing to this completely different space of foresight and futures thinking, and what you do now currently in your work.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. It's really, it's a genuine shift which took several years of thinking through what I wanted to do. And it's funny because the more I spend time trying to understand change and disruption, innovation, design thinking, the more I realized I was not doing that for my life. I basically had a trajectory. I chose a career. Admittedly, these are very, very good careers. I'm not, dismissing it, both in terms of what you learn, the exposure you get, the financial side. But I was on a road which was in a way kind of predetermined. This is what I chose. This is what I'm doing. And when I started becoming more immersed in transformation, in innovation and all these things through what I talked about earlier, I realized that I was not doing that with my own life. I was not prototyping. I was not agile. I was not testing things. I was not pivoting. I wasn't doing any of those things, which I think you should do and which we can talk about in a minute. So I actually intentionally for 5 years started understanding this better and started thinking, wait a minute, these aren't just concepts. This isn't academia or theories. This is actually very helpful tools and way of operating. And so I started assessing what did I enjoy most and how could I sort of define that portfolio approach, which I enjoyed and where I felt there was potentially a need. So I myself pivoted and did a number of things to get exposed to these new ideas.
So now that you've actually made that transition, what does your current work involve and what do you spend your time on?
Sure. So it's quite global. I tend to get up, I can have calls sometimes 7 or 8 a.m. here in Pacific time with Europe, and then I might have evening calls with Malaysia, Singapore, or the UAE. I'm very, very blessed because one, I have what I think to be the most amazing days. It's almost designed around things I enjoy and that. And pre and post COVID, in a way, it accelerated certain things post-COVID, but I would, it's a difficult and complicated time for a lot of people, which actually means that the activities I focus on are that much more in demand than needed. So actually, for me, it's been a very active time of seeing how to work on that. In terms of the specifics, I have a portfolio around a number of areas which have two features. One is that I'm fascinated by them. And two is that I feel that I can add value and contribute. So one aspect is advising on foresight strategy. So it's strategic, but instead of looking at the next 1, 2, or 3 years, or go to market, or how to do a product, or making a specific transaction or investment, which is maybe looking at the next few years, I try and look at things with a longer time horizon. And so the element of foresight is primarily that it's taking into account a multitude of different aspects that can impact the future, and that the time horizons are probably longer than many other activities. So that's the kind of advisory side. I sit on a few boards, so I'm a board member, or sit on strategic committees, so we can discuss key milestones in terms of strategy of the companies, and I'll be able to have certain reflexes by virtue of my experience, but also by looking at longer time horizons. I'm an angel investor, so I have the opportunity to invest in some promising frontier technology companies. My latest company is a super interesting AI edge company in Israel, so very interested in the entrepreneurial side, both as an advisor and as an investor. The thing that's gone through the roof since COVID is actually talking engagements. As I mentioned, this is my favorite because I actually think it's more useful and important to be speaking to the next generation who will hopefully save us from a lot of this mess. But I get paid, quite well for these kind of topics. And that has been a very strong demand to have keynote talks for leadership teams worldwide. I'm increasing the amount of writing I'm doing, and then I'm building the education side with a lot of content and courses around understanding and managing disruptive futures. So for me, day to day, it's lucky that I stumbled upon this activity and that I pivoted towards it. But it allows me to interact every day worldwide with incredible people and ecosystems, from academic to entrepreneurship, venture capital, the business world, government agencies, futures organizations. It's really very, very privileged to be able to have such interesting portfolio.
Great. So hopefully that gives people an idea of what you're doing and how you got there. And now I guess to transition into what is sort of the meat of this conversation, which is how can we as students and youth really use this insight that you've gained to future-proof our own careers and businesses as we go along in our own paths. So to start off, could you introduce the AAA framework that we as individuals can use to future-proof our own careers, and you advise businesses to use to future-proof their operations as well?
Yeah, so let me take a step back. Initially, one of the main observations I was kind of trying to think through was the impact of AI. And of course, many different ramifications and impacts. But the in particular, which stood out for me, one was how do we cohabitate with AI? Because we can't ignore the existence and the human augmentation we're benefiting from, but also the risk of what AI can bring. And thinking about where can we as humans add most value in the relationship with AI to stay relevant.
Yeah.
And so that's one aspect. And the second aspect is observing how AI is learning fast and moving up the value chain. So some time ago, machines were used in optimization. They were used for automation to accelerate repetitive tasks. Now we're finding them more and more in decision-making and augmentation roles, maybe even in creativity, designing things, creating things, even in art. So as AI improves and continues learning, I was trying to think about what does it mean for humans to be able to handle complex systems, and how should we be thinking about upgrading our activities? And so that's when I thought that it probably entailed three elements to make sure that we, as humans, they upgrade ourselves, continue to learn and stay relevant. And I defined it as AAA. So the first A is anticipatory, which is in a way one of the underlying principles and drivers for foresight and futures thinking, which is learning to sort of qualify signals, interpreting the next order impacts of change, connecting the dots between different things because we operate in interconnected systems. Being careful not to rely on oversimplification or risk modeling, which assumes a very stable and predictable world, and understanding the ramifications of exponential change. And so that's where anticipating that, you're kind of making sure you're not assuming that because something happened in the past, that it's a linear, stable, predictable, and therefore that it will continue in the future. You're trying to kind of distance yourself from that. So that's, the A for anticipatory. The second A is anti-fragile, where I borrowed this from Nassim Taleb's book, Anti-Fragile, and which is really a system which not only benefits from disorder or shock, but actually gets stronger. So he goes to some length to define how you can basically become anti-fragile or as an organization. And that means that when things happen that are, very big shocks, you're actually benefiting from that disproportionately than that. So just to give you concrete examples, it's building optionality through innovation, embracing adventure and risk. You're having small teams develop ideas which could be a big success as opposed to being hyper optimized. You're being centralized as opposed to thinking you need to have centralized decision making in very hierarchical organizations. You're fluid and evolving in terms of strategy. So it's really contrast to a lot of what companies do and a lot of the consultants advise, which is you should be optimized, you should be hyper efficient, you should be very centralized, very hierarchical, spend tons of R&D, and then one day it will work out. It's really a much more nimble, it's almost tinkering with things. It's almost, the classical Silicon Valley garage where, you put things together and you figure it out. And so that's the anti-fragile. And the third one is agility, to understand that there's a system that's at place, that's unpredictable, the interdependencies of moving parts, and therefore they are unknown unknowns, and they're not necessarily a range of right answers. And the agility is important because we're more and more in a complex world where there are no right answers. You can't rely on experts. It's not linear and straightforward. And therefore, you need to be agile enough to develop what we call emergent behavior, which is you're going to see based on your behavior and how you react, whether you want to amplify that if it's working, or on the opposite, you want to dampen that behavior if it's not working. And so you're continuously experimenting, tinkering, and failing fast if it's not working. And that requires agility. So the 3 A's are anticipatory, anti-fragile, and the agility to understand that it's not so straightforward in terms of cause and effect. Sometimes one uses terms and they might be a bit abstract or technical, but at the most simplest level, it's really harnessing curiosity, harnessing creativity, thinking about going against the grain, not assuming that because something is done in a certain way or was always done in a way that it will be like that. Understanding that change can happen through different ways and that you can be the instigator of that. And so it's really that curiosity which can lead you on a path. And then in a way, what's really amazing is you don't have the insecurity complex, because it doesn't matter whether you're a big company, whether you're a small company, whether whatever your background. So day to day, to give you concrete examples, what I'm doing now is trying to apply that, which is I set up a foresight consultancy practice completely out of the blue, having done something completely different for 20 years in an environment where other people have been practicing it for decades. And actually, guess what? It's working phenomenally well, because what I've been doing in the past is actually very valuable and complementary. And then I saw that there was a gap on the education side of these topics, and that I love talking and writing about these topics, and that there was demand for it. And I'm approaching it in a different way, building an institute from scratch and seeing the interest in these topics. And in a normal world, you would maybe think, okay, well, do I have the knowledge? Is the market there? And you'd go through all kinds of things. Whereas I'm kind of thinking, well, let me just try it and see whether it bites and works and adapt and evolve. And so it is really interesting because it's really, for those who are familiar with design thinking, that process of just ideating, prototyping, testing, and then coming back to kind of refine and pivot,
Yeah, that's fascinating. So you talked a little bit about the education system, and I'm really interested in that topic. So how does that translate to how we as individuals and even we as a society should approach higher education, and what we can do to reform it and make it more, I guess, future-proofed?
So that's the big question, right? And I'm relying, and hopefully the world as well, on the next generations to do a better job, because I really don't find that currently the leaders, whether they're countries or organizations, are necessarily, having the right kind of filters in terms of decisions and that. And I think one of the areas is this assumption, which is clearly wrong, but which is not reflected in the way the world behaves, which is the world is not linear, the world is not stable and predictable. And that little assumption basically is a problem, because the way people are trained at university and schools, the way leaders are selected in companies, a lot of the company strategies, a lot of the way governments operate are in a way which assumes that the past predicts the future. And therefore, take the whole educational system, which is basically knowledge driven. It assumes that there's value in knowledge alone, and it's overplaying the value of knowledge. Whereas in a world which is complex, where there are no right answers, where there are unknown unknowns, and where cause and effect is not easy to distinguish unless it's sort of subsequently, knowledge in its own right is of limited value, not to mention when you're cohabitating with AI, what is the value of knowledge? So I'd answer your question in two ways. I think, first of all, as you point out, from a societal perspective, I would love to see basically three focus areas for the 21st century skills, right? The one, which is the foundational core skills, which presumably most schools and education deal with, the literacy, numeracy, scientific, and all that. So the foundational core skills are not less important, but it's probably too much of close to 100% of the system. The second area, competencies, in terms of, how can students, how can young citizens approach complex challenges? And that's everything to do with problem solving, critical thinking, creativity, collaboration. And then the third piece is the character qualities, right, which allow you to approach changing environments, the things we talked about: initiative, curiosity, persistence, grit, adaptability, social, cultural awareness, and that. And so in a time where children are entering primary school and will leave that to jobs which don't even exist yet, and at a time where the educational knowledge-based system is rewarding students for repeating answers to questions which we already have answers to, where you can't be curious, where you can't fail, where you kind of have to kind of be relatively normed in terms of convention, you're not learning to be comfortable with the ambiguity, uncertainty, and complexity of the world. You're not learning to try, to fail, to experiment, to iterate, to actually think that there's value in failure, that the more you fail, the more you're discovering and the more you're probably learning. And so that for me is a big concern with the world that's changing, at an exponential rate, and that velocity is continuing. To have linear thinking and linear knowledge-based schooling is not ideal. So sorry for the slightly long answer, but it's a topic which is really one that's dear to me. Maybe just on the second part of your question, in terms of ideally, what would it look like, the ideal system? And, I'm happy to be under the scrutiny. Well, I do my best, and I'm happy to be under the scrutiny of people who might consider that I know nothing about the topic, which is probably fair. Whether that's an advantage or a disadvantage, I don't know. I'm not an educator, and so, but for what it's worth, my observations in terms of what I would think would be an ideal way of thinking about future schools, one is probably futures thinking. And I personally get the sense that a lot of what you're taught on school is looking backwards. It's looking at the history and the past as opposed to looking forward. So if you take, for instance, languages and choosing languages, should data itself be treated as a language? Should data be taught at school? If you're looking at the time frames, the implications, not anticipating things, not thinking about possibility of pandemics, not thinking about climate change, all these things clearly longer timeframes are needed, because the assumption of a 3-stage life that's linear is not consistent with the 100-year life and the way many things require, longer timeframes. The importance of starting in the background, we talked about encouraging kids to experience failure, to experiment, to frame things around inadequacies. Should we be measuring failures as opposed to success, for instance? Should we think about replacing standardized tests, which you can just spot for, with something more adventurous? And then there are one or two areas which I've observed with strong interest in countries that are very, very innovative, like Israel. 45% of the Israeli population is under 24, and that includes the majority of the elite military units. And this, I'm not being political or anything in relation to Israel or military or anything, but it is a fact that these youngsters are in their high teens or low 20s and are basically running some of these elite units, which means that effectively, whether it's through the military or even more generally in Israel as a young adult, really a trusted leader with real responsibility and forged discipline, as opposed to thinking that it matters that you clock 10 or 20 years in a company or have a particular hierarchy and centralized view of the world, which is just simply doesn't mean anything. So to really give the young citizens a key role in society, and that starts at school. And then I would say two other elements. One is to encourage, ambiguity, uncertainty, and complexity. I think we have to learn that those are not exceptions. That is the norm, and what that means, and live it and breathe it and love it every day. And then the final thing is the debate around specialization versus beginner's mind. And I think the best option is probably to accept that both are important, and to move to the different, X shapes and T shapes and different things, as opposed to maybe over relying on experts, which you need, but there's a limitation in relying on experts too much, because it assumes that there's a right answer and that you can rely on experts. Whereas we all know that a lot of the more and more so going forward, cross-pollination comes from ideas that come from different perspectives. I'm almost going to say that I don't believe anymore that you have different sectors or industries for expertise. I think that, and we didn't talk about it, but one of the important trends is convergence and even fusion of different technologies, and not just technologies for that matter. And so when you look at, I don't know, take 3D printing, you have materials technology, you have design. If you look at some of the breakthroughs, the first 3D printed artificial heart, I'll let you imagine what industry is that, first of all, 3D printed heart? Is it industrial? Is it healthcare? Is it biotech? But also, if you think about the different areas of expertise and so I think that you're more and more in a world where there's convergence in terms of different things, and where you can't separate specific industries or sectors or specialization that easily. And I think in a linear world, you have right answers, and you can look at life in a binary way, right? You can choose options. You can think about what are the options and choose options, or what is the right answer, or what have you. But for me, just in terms of definition, a complex world has no right answers, unknown unknowns, and there's a significant interconnectedness. So therefore, the cross-fertilization between people with deep expertise, but also broad expertise, is more likely to give combinations, because the patterns are harder to interpret. So it's in that sense that I feel that you really need to think about X-shaped profiles or neo-generalist tendencies, as opposed to being too specialized. And that, to the discussion we're having earlier, is the educational system adapted to thinking like that? Are companies organized to think about that? Yeah. I think that's so important. And I think we could probably spend an entire conversation just talking about the education system and how to reform it and things like that. Let's do that.
Yeah. But I guess for now, just to transition to some more different topics, we actually had a question in the chat where someone asks, what criteria and processes do you use for selecting a company to invest in? And I'm really curious to hear your answer to that as well.
So I'm going to give a very concrete example of the company I mentioned earlier. Why did I choose to invest in an AI edge company in Israel? And let's even define what AI edge is. I'm going to spend a few minutes with a very concrete example of both the way I thought about it, but also an actual investment and the criteria I used.
Yeah.
So first of all, what's AI Edge? AI Edge is artificial intelligence, and Edge is, in effect, it allows you to reduce the latency periods of the communications compared to having to go to cloud or data centers. So if you think of mobility and autonomous vehicles and autonomous driving, you can see that if there's too much latency between the decision where a car might need to detect someone crossing the road and then braking and then taking the decisions, you can see that the risk is huge, right? And so the latency period is very important. So a lot of the developments on AI are done on the what's called the edge to reduce that latency period. The second element is I'm seeing a change. If I look at the next order implications in semiconductors and chips, which is the following. Basically, there's a complete shift in the value chains because the hyperscalers, the Googles, the Tencents, Alibaba, all of these guys, Apple, they realize that a lot of the technology breakthroughs in AI are actually coming through hardware. And that's where the deep learning is happening. And so the previous hyper-optimized, outsource what you can for semiconductors, which has been the world until now, is no longer the case. The hyperscalers are not outsourcing it, they're developing that in-house. And so, and in fact, Intel bought Habana for $2 billion just before around Christmas time, precisely for that reason. So even a chip manufacturer is looking for the right expertise. I invested in a competitor to Habana Networks. So what are we looking at here? You're looking at disruption whereby a chip manufacturer like Intel, who gets it, they work with futurists, they work with science fiction writers, they understand the longer cycles. Obviously, you know, Andy Grove and all the very famous people around, only the paranoid survive. So they basically understand that you're moving from chip manufacturing to autonomous driving and then ultimately to smart city. And so the semiconductor players who are thinking about just being an outsourcer to the world, God knows what will happen to them in over time, because ultimately the shift is happening. And you're seeing that because Mercedes-Benz is basically telling you that they see the operating system being NVIDIA, which is a competitor to Intel. So basically, the value of a car, 90% of the value of a car and what it is to be a car is actually a chip manufacturer as opposed to an automotive manufacturer. It doesn't mean anything to be Mercedes or Volkswagen or Ford or anything. And so when you think about all that, you're not thinking about just automation, which is the next few years of technology change and disruption. You're thinking about fundamental transformation, industries reshaping themselves. And so I'm not saying I'm successful. Time will tell whether my investments are successful. But then to come back to the original question is, what do I do when I look at investment? I try and look at the next order implications of where things are going. And I take a bet. And I take a bet on something which I feel is probably more fundamental than fashionable. And that's kind of where I go for it. And so there's a direct link between foresight and, you know, futures thinking because of the time cycles, disruption and transformation, and a number of other things. And then I've got a management team and a million things. But fundamentally, I'm taking a bet on where certain industries might be going, where the scarcity and the value will be in those next order implications. And it's not necessarily that the other companies weren't looking to the future, but they were looking to the future in the same way as they've been always looking to the future, which is an assumption of the world being linear and predictable. And so they thought they were looking to the future, and they were leaders in the industries, and they've been leaders for 10 years, and they were thinking they were following what's happening. But because they didn't understand the impact of exponential growth, because they didn't understand the velocity of change, because they assumed that the world was kind of predictable and stable and linear, they never imagined. And that's why a lot of the amazing innovations have not come from the legacy players. And people like Clayton Christensen talk a lot about, you know, what disruptive innovation is and all that. But there is an element which is directly linked to foresight and futures, which is, you know, it's not the established food manufacturers which came up with alternatives to meat, like Beyond Meat. It's not, you know, it needed Tesla or NVIDIA to come up with that. It's not the automotive players. Zoom came out of nowhere. Why didn't Verizon or other people do that? Verizon bought 2 months ago during the pandemic a little company called Blue Jeans for video conferencing because they didn't really realize that And to be honest, this has nothing to do with COVID. COVID just accelerated it. But anybody in an operator should realize that whether there's COVID or not, ultimately you would be doing virtual working. Ultimately, you'd be doing telemedicine and remote healthcare, and you'd need enterprise-grade video conferencing over time. So this has nothing to do with COVID. COVID just accelerated it and fleshed out the gaps for those who didn't think about the future in the right way.
Yeah, I think that really gives us more of an concrete look at what sort of things a business should be focusing on to future-proof themselves. So another related question in the chat is, what do you think is the best example of a startup that pivoted after COVID-19, and what worked specifically for them?
Wow, these are great but tough questions. Well, I mean, listen, Zoom is hardly a startup. It's a listed company and that. But I would say that I know they got some slack for security and for a bunch of things. But for them to be able to have scaled the way they did overnight, address in a very open way what they did, I think is pretty admirable. I think it's unfortunate that it hasn't yet yielded fruits. But there's a lot that's happening with some of the drug discovery and AI and all these things. I wouldn't say they necessarily pivoted because their job was to kind of do drug discovery. And you could almost argue that it's a failure because they haven't been able to come up with the goods in terms of a vaccine and that. But I do think that in a short amount of time, there are a lot of areas around, bioengineering and drug discovery and that. But maybe these are not good examples of actual successes. There's one, I'll just give you a concrete example, which is involved in a lot of the architecture, engineering, and construction on the software side, and CAD CAM, so you to be able to do that from virtually to design a house and all that. And they've been working hand in hand with basically all the developers of the companies or the people who manage the companies, because every single company will need to kind of redesign itself, right? And so I don't know if it's a pivot, but initially it was, a focus which was entirely focused on construction and new builds and all of that. And then they shifted to where a lot of the investment is now going, which is the inside of buildings, which are being completely redesigned and reshaped and that.
Interesting. Yeah, and I guess we'll find out more about whether some of the drug discovery companies actually had a successful pivot or not, based on whether they can develop a vaccine or not in the future, right? So I think it's going to take probably a longer time frame for them to be able to demonstrate success.
You're right, and you're being very fair to the industry.
So another question I have for you is, what are some misconceptions or mistakes we as young people are making when carving out our own career paths and thinking about the future?
Yeah, I would personally try and avoid the framework of thinking about specific industries anymore. I don't believe there's a distinction between industries as such.
Yeah.
I think most companies should or will have an underlying technology base and be a technology company. You then have the convergence. When you have the convergence of artificial intelligence with 5G, with Internet of Things, with sensors, with immersive reality, with biology, and even the fusion between digital, physical, and biological, you're ending up with a lot of areas of cross-pollination, which means that it's not as obvious to sort of say, this or that industry is the right one to go for. And I think agtech is a good example, agriculture and technology, where you have, machine learning, you have robotics, you have genetics, you have plant breeding, you have all kinds of things, right? And climate and all that. So, and then the last point on that is, because of systems thinking, everything is connected. So what does that mean in terms of how to frame it? I think for me, what it means is that you should really be trying to immerse yourself as best as you can in terms of the trends that are happening, in terms of what are the signals you're seeing, in terms of connecting the dots. And I know it might sound a bit repetitive and it sounds a little bit self-centered to talk about futures and foresight, because that's my current focus. But I arrived at that because after 2 decades of doing something else, I felt for me and my clients and the world was not connecting the dots and thinking in terms of systems and understanding what complex is, and that's the new reality. And so I really think that the best way to think about the industries to focus on for all of you girls and guys and everyone is really just to understand, to think of things in longer term time horizon, to think about what signals mean, to be very curious, to try things, and to really see the connectivity and how the dots can connect, and then to continue to monitor that because it evolves. And that's something which I think, if you're relying on what the educational system is feeding you, or what you're learning, or what your direct, entourage and friends and systems and institutions are kind of giving you access to, you may actually miss out the direction of where certain things are going, and which are fantastic areas which you might be very good at, have ideas, be able to play a very important role in. And so the best advice I can give is really just to understand that you can't think of things in terms of industries, in terms of things being disconnected, and in terms of the way the world might have seemed in the past. In other words, if you think about how the future is emerging, and you're decoding those signals, and you're thinking about the decisions you make on these changes, I would give one example. We are noting that after a phase of the software eating the world, which is, everything was becoming software, you're starting to note that software is eating software now. So you're starting to see more and more of the next order impact, where there's no code or low code, and where software is replacing infrastructure, and where there are a number of things that are happening. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's not extremely important to do engineering. I'm not saying there won't be a huge demand for engineering that's growing through the roof. But I'm just saying one could argue that as machines learn, and machine learning, and become more clever, and there's a no code or low code environment, which is a lot of developments in that area, and where creativity and philosophy and ethics and other debates are maybe less well understood, and maybe a little bit harder for machines in a complex world, whether there could be sort of some things to think about. And I'm not sure today, when you give people advice that there's an immediate STEM engineering is good, other things are bad or less good. And I think that's not necessarily so simple.
Yeah, that makes sense, and obviously connects with everything you outlined before. So along the same lines, in the coming few years in college and right after that, what sort of opportunities, either inside the education system or outside it, should we specifically be looking for? Yeah,
so a few elements on that. I think, first of all, if one has a particular interest and one's good at it or one likes it, that no reason not to go for that. So I'm not, that's great. The subtleties I'm bringing into it are the following. One is, one shouldn't just rely on the hyper specialization on the basis that the industry or the subject you're learning with the view of doing a particular profession or moving into a particular industry. That assumption can be dangerous, because over the next 5, 10, 15 or 20 years, there can be so many changes in terms of the assumptions you're making. So that's number one. Number two is, you should think about potentially multiple careers and multiple lives and different ways of connecting it. You're moving towards a 100-year life. You're moving towards things that are very different. And it's very interesting. Stanford did an interesting study with the design school on Stanford 2025, imagining what education in the future could look like. And the two key takeaways were, number one is that it wasn't you come in and you do 3 years and you come out. It was more, okay, you're buying 7 or 10 years of education throughout your life. And the second thing is that they were not saying you should sort of be affiliated to this or that faculty or expertise, but rather there would be a central hub, which is your portfolio, and you might move from one to the other. And that's the cross-fertilization side. So it's not to discourage you all from doing what you believe in and what you're interested in. It's more, you shouldn't necessarily do that assuming that that is fine, and to the extent that you're no longer exploring and interested in anything else, because things are so interconnected. And the second thing is, whatever assumptions you're making about the professions you're going to do, or the jobs or the industries you're going to go in, you'll need to think, indeed, to your point, Sanat, around the skills and the competencies and the character and the qualities you're building and the people you know and the ecosystem and the ideas, because those may not be there in the same way 5, 10, 15 or 20 years. And so you're 20, you're finishing studies at 24, and you're kind of thinking, okay, even 20 years after that, you're 44, and you're not even halfway through your life. You're kind of stuck if that's all you've been relying on. So that's the kind of message I'm trying to share from my perspective. I think this is extremely positive, what I've just described. I don't think anybody should be scared of it. I think the reason I think it's phenomenally positive is because it means you're more free and you have agency. Things will change. And therefore, it doesn't matter if you've studied A or you studied B, or you didn't get into the school you wanted, or you didn't go to school at all, because these things will matter less. There are no limits. Basically, you can be the instigator, the beneficiary, and the driver of these changes and disruptions. You don't have a predetermined playbook which says, okay, if you do ABC, that's what happens. And if you've done ABC, that's what you can do. And if you haven't done it for the past 5 years, then sorry, that's the end of it. I actually, from a philosophical perspective and, thinking about existential philosophy, I think it's a huge advantage because it means you have more agency and freedom about building the future you want and about the choices you make. And there are less ramifications around because of causality, because I took a certain course of action. This is the immediate consequence of it that I have to live with for the rest of the life. So I just want to make that comment as we approach the end, because I think it can be scary to have all this change in the background, to have all these uncertainty and ambiguity. But once again, I think the way I would frame it and think about it is that it's a huge opportunity, which almost validates the importance of testing things, of trying, of prototyping, of being creative, of being a little bit of a, creating chaos and not necessarily following the party line and having your own ideas on that.
Yeah, I definitely believe we have an inspiring future ahead of us if we decide to take control over it and actually make it an inspiring future. So it's great to hear you say that. And we actually have a question in the chat from Siddharth. He asks, what have you learned from all of your time advising Berkeley Skydeck and working with the young entrepreneurs over there?
Yeah, the main thing is really the fact that I don't understand how a lot of companies and organizations and even governments still use the hierarchy where there's value attributed to length of experience and age and all of that. I think what's amazing is that you can see there's no restrictions or limits to where ideas can come from and where good ideas can come from. And so you should have those ideas. You should think about it. There are a lot of they're wonderful Skydeck cohorts, which are actually much more experienced, and that's a fantastic thing. And it's not a problem to be much more experienced or to be, have a different age bracket. And there are many that are super young and doing amazing stuff, and that's fine as well. And the important thing is just to sort of be receptive to a lot of things we talk about, because then you'll go onto a Skydeck or you'll be curious to be involved with different people and ecosystems, and you'll know where to collaborate to bridge the gaps. So you'll know where you need people who have more experience in this area or more of that. But it doesn't prevent you, as a young citizen, to lead change, to be very creative and entrepreneurship. And if you apply all the smart things which which your instincts drive you towards, hopefully you'll notice those gaps and be able to have help on the way for areas where you feel you need it. So I love that young, dynamic, innovative environment. It's amazing. It's not limited to Skydeck or the US or Silicon Valley. It's happening everywhere in the world, and the more the better.
Yeah, I definitely believe that, and that's the reason I'm interviewing these young people on the 21st Century Visionary podcast, and I've seen the amazing things that they're doing, so that's great. And before we come to the close here, Roger, I have 2 more questions for you. The first one is, what are your most recommended books or resources for young people to explore and learn from?
No, that's cool. So on the Innovator's Dilemma, listen, it's a landmark book, right? It's the first, it coined the term disruptive innovation, and it's linked to some of the things we talked about, which is why some of the leading established incumbent companies aren't the one coming up with new ideas. And it sort of explains how sometimes, they're worried about cannibalization, and it just talks about, why that is, and it explains it. It doesn't necessarily take exactly the same perspective of 1 or 2 of the things I mentioned around the importance of being anticipatory or the lack of predictability of that. But the concept is the same, which is, what is the frame of mind of an individual, of an organization that can have fresh and new ideas? And when do you how are you able to sort of turn those into something? And why is it often not to have that fresh day one, that new perspective on things, which the Zen Buddhists talk a lot about. How do you have that, and Jeff Bezos talks about it all the time, how do you have that day one perspective on things? It's to avoid it. So that's just a phenomenal book. And, many people of you will know it. And if not, you must read it. In terms of resources, feel free to check out the Disruptive Futures Institute. It's just kind of launched recently. We'll be ramping up the content. And the idea is really a lot of it will be free, to try and provide tools to be more sensitive to some of these topics and practical frameworks to address them. The second thing is stay very close, to my mind, to some of the organizations. It's all free. Just sign up to newsletters, keep it simple, or get more involved if you wish to, but that do have a sort of futures and foresight mindset, whether it's people like Yuval Harari and what he writes, whether it's the World Economic Forum, whether it's Bill Gates, whether for foresight, there's an organization called Teach the Future, which Peter Bishop runs, whether it's newsletters from Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, or Singularity University, or some fellow futurists like Gerd Leonard or whatever you. So just be mindful that you have to be tuned into all this. If not, you will make assumptions and not necessarily take the right opportunities you could have. And then the final piece is, obviously, there are many, many books. And so I'll spend 30 seconds on each just to sort of give the why I'm including them.
Yeah.
But many of you will know, Carol Dweck, The Growth Mindset. So it talks a lot about what we've been thinking about in terms of, thinking with a new perspective and innovation and being curious and trying things. And it's a very important book. No particular order. Second one, it's actually father and son, Daniel Susskind and Richard Susskind from the UK, who wrote a book called The Future of Professions: How Technology Will Transform the Work of Human Experts. And it's a very important book, because it doesn't matter whether you're thinking of doing the professions that they're writing about. They actually spend a lot of time about law and think about law, how law evolves, but it just will give you an understanding of how you really need to think about transformation and outcomes of a profession, and not just automation. So they give the example as lawyers that you can't just think of, can a lawyer automate the legal pleadings and the analysis? You need to think about, what is the purpose of law and a court case, and what are the outcomes? Because you can have transformation, which gives you two different outcomes without doing the same thing. So the distinction between automation, which is short-term thinking of the next few years, versus fundamental transformation, where you get to the same outcomes or change, but in a different way. I mentioned Yuval Noah Harari, phenomenal. You have to be tuned into some of the things he's saying. He's on podcasts, he does videos, but one good book is 21 Lessons for the 21st Century as a starting point. We talked about specialization versus, broader range. There's a book called Range, which is Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World by David Epstein, which I think is important, because as the world is more complicated, I think the patterns are harder to interpret. And so, you can connect the dots better. And we've talked about some of those themes. Two fellow Stanford professors who are very focused on design thinking wrote a book called Design Your Life, which literally takes the design thinking process and prototype in terms of how you should be thinking about your life. I've done my best to reflect one or two ideas, but they've written an entire book just on that, and it's worth doing. So it's called Design Your Life, Bill Burnett and Dave Evans. A friend of mine, Inbal Arieli, in Israel, talks about disruptive innovation and entrepreneurship, and why Israel is a hub for innovation and entrepreneurship. The book is called Chutzpah, Why Israel is a Hub for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and that's Inbal Arieli. It's very interesting. Again, what's the mindset that allows you to challenge things and to come up with new ideas as opposed to just regurgitating knowledge? That starts at school. There's a very important book called The Grey Rhino by Michelle Walker, which talks about anticipating signals and why, to my mind, COVID is a grey rhino and not a black swan. There were signs and signals. One could have decoded them, interpreted them, and done something about it, as opposed to just ignoring them. So that's The Grey Rhino by Michelle Walker. Penultimate one is called Anti-Fragile, Things That Gain from Disorder. Nassim Taleb has a 5-volume works called Incerto. All of them are phenomenal, but Anti-Fragile is just essential reading for anyone. And the last one I'll mention is a bit more AI and China, and I think a very important topic, which is AI Superpowers, China, Silicon Valley, and New World Order by Kai-Fu Lee. Kai-Fu Lee is a very important investor with his Sinovision fund in AI. He's the I think, CEO of Google in China. He's an academic. I had the chance of speaking to him a few times and meeting him at some of his launches and other events. Kai-Fu Lee is phenomenal. And I think, honestly, whether it's podcasts, whether it's video, whether it's YouTube, whatever it is, I would honestly consider it almost dangerous, given everything that's happened in the world, and I would have said that a year ago pre-COVID, not to be tuned into some of these concepts.
Yeah, that's a really comprehensive list, and I think we'll definitely have our reading list full now. And if people weren't convinced to read it enough from hearing it from you, I think the final statement really puts it in perspective. And
I don't get royalties. I don't get kickbacks on these. It's really because... No, I'm kidding. But
yeah. So just to wrap up, Roger, final question. The question I ask all my guests is, what does your vision for the 21st century look like?
Yeah, so my ideal future is that some of the things we talked about, and not because none of these are my ideas, most of it I've drawn from many of the people I've mentioned and dozens others. But my hope is that, your generation, Gen Alpha, and everybody else will be thinking about the importance of how flawed some of the assumptions are, and therefore focusing on some of the areas which don't rely on the assumptions of a linear, stable world, which understand some of these topics and which build that into the way of making decisions, to the educational system, if it's called that, to the way people manage the portfolio of lives and careers they have, to the choices they make at a personal level, to the way policymakers and governments and decision makers think. My hope is that, and one of the elements is short-termism, which is probably one of the biggest dangers of the world. And so by definition, futures is the opposite of that. The other is the assumption of predictability and just flawed assumptions, which basically mean that, the third is not understanding what's happening with exponential technologies and AI and just, having the head in the sand, and then suddenly gradually it changes, and then suddenly it hits you like COVID. It's only at the end that you realize what exponential means and the impact of these things. So for me, these are not small topics. It's got nothing to do with technology. It's got nothing to do with just Silicon Valley or innovation. It has to do with pretty much how every single country, organization, and person is kind of running and thinking about life. And so you guys have a lot of responsibility in terms of trying to think about the mistakes we've all been making and continue to make, and trying to think about what allows you to be more tuned in to other things and to hopefully not make the same mistakes. And I personally believe that some of the topics we talked about would help avoid some of the mistakes that are kind of pretty pervasive, unfortunately. Yeah.
That really ties into the mission of this podcast, is just to help young people do just that. So thank you so much, Roger, for doing this and taking the time. Like you mentioned, you have a really busy schedule and you get paid to do a lot of these talks in corporate environments. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share your insights with us and the next generation.
Pleasure.
Thank you for listening to 21st Century Visionary. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to be notified when new episodes are released. You can also share the podcast, tell a friend, or rate and review us. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at 21st Century Visionary. Our website, studentspod.com, is now up and running, where you can find the show notes and links to resources mentioned in every episode, the blog post, and sign up for our newsletter, where we pick out the most interesting advice, quotes, and tidbits from every episode exclusively delivered to your inbox every week. Lastly, you can reach us directly at our email, thevisionarypod@gmail.com, if you have suggestions or just want to say hi. Until next time, stay home and stay tuned.